I am so tickled to introduce Michelle Fitzgerald because we used to work together a number of years ago at Historic London Town and Gardens, which is near Annapolis. And so I'm just like super thrilled to reconnect with her. Yeah. Reconnect with her. She is the curator of collections at Johns Hopkins University Museums, which is comprised of the university's 2 historic houses, Homewood Museum, which is what she's going to be talking about today, and Evergreen Museum and Library. Please give a warm welcome to Michelle Fitzgerald.
Thank you all so much for inviting me here today. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. This is a beautiful space to be talking into, so it's such a pleasure. As Kristen said, my name is Michelle Fitzgerald, and I'm the Curator of Collections for Johns Hopkins University Museums. Great question earlier, why is it plural? We have 2 of them. I'll be talking about Homewood today, so you're going to learn more about that, but I'll just give you a quick shout out to Evergreen Museum and Library, which is our other one. It's in Baltimore, it's a Gilded Age mansion, and it's completely different from this house. So if you're looking for a day to tour historic houses and see 2 different sides of the 19th century, come visit us. But today we're going to focus on Homewood, which has really been the star of the show this year. For those of you who may not be familiar with Homewood, it was constructed beginning in 1801 for Charles Carroll of Homewood, the son of Declaration of Independence signer Charles Carroll of Carrollton. They are all Charles Carroll. It is confusing. It's one of the best examples of federal Palladian architecture, which is what earned it a National Historic Landmark status in 1971. Originally, it was intended as a summer country estate for the Carrolls, but Baltimore has really grown around the house, and its location is currently on the present-day Johns Hopkins University campus, called the Homewood campus, and now it's very much so in what I would call a downtown part of Baltimore. And you will too if you try to find parking here right now. So, as you may have heard, 2026 is the semi-sesquicentennial of the United States. But what you may not know is that the year also marks the sesquicentennial of Johns Hopkins University. So we've been saying sesquicentennial a lot this year. With this landmark anniversary year coming up, we knew that JHU Museums would want to commemorate it with an exhibition that would appeal to our audience of students, their families from all over the world, and our visitors to Baltimore. And for us, it always made sense that the center of these 2 anniversaries would take place at Homewood. Anytime we have an exhibition, we discuss between ourselves which house is the better fit for it. And we always knew a 250th had to be at Homewood. Over the course of the house's 224-year history, it has borne witness to the majority of our experiences as a country, the good and the bad. And our archives at the university highlight moments of celebration, oppression, empowerment, and tragedy in a way that echoes a complete history of our country during an anniversary year of reflection. So since 1910, Homewood has been the name of Hopkins Homewood campus, and in fact was the architectural source for early Hopkins buildings on the campus. So every year around September, we do get students coming into our gift shop looking for their chemistry class. It's confused generations of them. Through the majority of pivotal moments in Hopkins history, Homewood has been an anchor of the campus landscape. And as we touched on with the National Historic Landmark designation, Homewood was preserved because of its impressive Palladian architecture that spoke to a feeling of power that it was impressing upon its visitors. Long after the Carrolls left, the house had many incarnations that were in many ways inspired by its historic importance as a Palladian structure. So I keep mentioning the architecture because I think it's important to note that Homewood doesn't get saved because of anything important that happens at Homewood. It is saved for its architectural significance. So when considering what Homewood says about American history and in turn Hopkins history, I thought it would make the most sense to turn the story over to the house for the first time, using the house as a micro-history where we focus on just the history through the events that happened at Homewood. This 1801 museum has the ability to tell countless stories through the individuals that lived, labored, and learned in its halls. We use the bones of Homewood and the minor changes made to the building over time to demonstrate how the experiences of individuals throughout history had an impact on the house. We wanted our present-day students to see how each era had moments of really intense darkness and joy, individual experiences that were impacted by larger events, and ultimately were materially inscribed into Homewood with each successive generation. To us, the story of American history is not a story of major events led by wealthy, exceptional individuals. It's a multitude of voices that are clamoring to be heard, and we're fortunate at Homewood to have a lot of firsthand narratives that speak to that. For exhibition purposes, because this exhibit also tried to incorporate as many student curators and classes as possible, so we kind of needed to corral everything going on, and we did so by putting them into 3 major themes that appear in each period of the house's life, and that's power, resistance to power, and education. During today's talk, I'm going to walk you through a sample of key periods in Homewood's history that we have covered in this exhibition in the hopes of showing you how this house is an example of these larger stories. So consider this a sort of teaser for the exhibit. From a countryside estate that enslaved upwards of 30 people to a site of student-organized protest, Homewood captured many conversations related to American identity. While we talk about this one house's history, though, I encourage you to reflect on how Homewood is not exceptional in this. That every building constructed in the United States, whether a National Historic Landmark or not, has an American story to tell that's just as important to our 250 years. And at Homewood, this story begins in 1801 with the first owners of the house. Originally, it was the hunting grounds of the Susquehannock people, but the land was sold as Merriman's Lot in the 17th century and purchased by Charles Carroll of Carrollton, our signer, upon the marriage of his only son, also Charles, to Harriet Chew of Philadelphia. The Carrolls were one of the wealthiest families in Maryland, among the largest enslavers, and had roots in the state dating to its earliest colonial days, when they came to Maryland in search of religious freedom for their Catholic faith. Charles Carroll of Carrollton establishes himself in history as an outspoken patriot during the Revolutionary War. If you are into the Revolutionary War, I would highly encourage reading his writings. They are a little sassy and it's kind of fun, but they're also wonderful. He was also the only Catholic, and he was the longest living signer of the Declaration of Independence. The union of his son and what seems to have been a love match with an eligible bachelorette from another prominent patriot family was a nice establishment of identity for this family. He gave his son the land and $10,000 to construct a summer estate for the newlyweds. Ultimately, he spent 4 times that in the house's construction. And there are a lot of letters between father and son where the father is not very happy about that. Unfortunately, Charles Carroll of Homewood was also an alcoholic and a sexual and physical abuser. His marriage to Harriet lasted 16 years until she and her daughters left for Philadelphia, taking the majority of Homewood's furniture with them. Their time at Homewood was unhappy, but the structure of the house demonstrates their expectations at the happy beginning of their union as a powerful family in the newly founded United States. So I've used the word Palladian quite a bit at this point to describe Homewood. You've probably heard this word before, especially in relation to Thomas Jefferson's famed Monticello, but let's provide some quick context to that. Andrea Palladio was a 16th century Italian architect who believed that the key to beauty was in symmetry and in order. His work is characterized by its use of classical elements pulled from ancient Roman and Greek architecture, like temple fronts that followed a strict mathematical formula to signal to visitors an impression of power. So we have a page of Palladio here, and you can see how mathematical it is. And there's a lot of emphasis on symmetry. In 1570, Palladio published his thoughts on architecture in 4 volumes. Fast forward 165 years later, in 1735, an English architect, Isaac Ware, translated and published Palladio's works, and they became this huge hit in 18th century England for country house design. Towards the 3rd quarter of the 18th century, Palladianism, strict Palladianism's popularity in England is starting to sort of wane, and architect Robert Adam helps to establish this neoclassical Adam-esque style. So it's sort of this modernized spin on Palladianism exteriors, which we see here in his design of the 1760s English country estate, Kettleston Hall. And you can see this is, over here we have the entrance if you were entering Kettleston as a guest of this family. So it feels like you're walking into a temple, and it's not that they're missing furniture. This is what it looked like. And it's that sort of stark, solemn approach to it. And you're meant to have that feeling of awe. The floor plan at Homewood is a really nice example of how Palladianism and that neoclassical Adamask element sort of translates to American architecture. And you can see that symmetry really well here. You can see in the room on the bottom left, it's a little difficult to see, but in this room here, you see how when we have windows, they go all the way through, and there's a little dent right here? That is our ghost window to ensure that the house looked symmetrical from the outside, even when a window wasn't needed inside. Another thing you might catch with this floor plan is that Homewood is also laid out in a style known as the Maryland five-part plan. And the five-part plan consists of one main central block house, so it's usually 2 rooms wide by 2 rooms deep. There's 2 hyphens that connect the main block, and there's 2 wings established at either end of the hyphens. And the design is not only architecturally allowed, it not only architecturally allows specific designations and routes for the house, with private and service areas sort of cordoned off from entertainment spaces for guests. It's also meant that during hot Chesapeake summers, you could open the doors at Homewood that you see in the boxes here, and air would circulate optimally throughout the house. And there's some really amusing stories in this time when you see these five-part plans of people who were constructing or making additions to their houses from England. They hadn't been over here yet, and they would kind of plop a room on the back of the house, and people would complain how hot it was in the space. This is a style that you most often see in 18th century homes in Annapolis, such as the Hammond Harwood house on the bottom right and the James Bryce house on the top left. However, Homewood is a good survival of the Baltimore incarnation of this style, showing how the stylistic significance of the Palladian interior could be adjusted for the specific environmental needs of where these houses were constructed. So in the early United States, Palladianism was still at the height of style, but these Adamask interiors were also intriguingly fashionable to early Americans. In 1801, the United States, just getting this mindset for a second, they're a new country seeking a place on the Western world stage dominated by European powers who could point to ancient buildings and architectural ruins in their country as a sign of their long legacy of importance. By choosing to champion Palladianism in their public buildings and country estates, Americans were tying themselves stylistically to famous ancient democracies before them, setting this very intentional identity for themselves, expressed through architectural forms, designs. You see a lot of the sort of Grecian look to a lot of these houses. By bringing American symbolism into private homes through architectural design or inclusion of trademarks of Americans like George Washington and the bald eagle, wealthy Americans were displaying their patriotism and enthusiasm for this new American experiment. At Homewood, these architectural and decor symbols had another role of highlighting the family's proximity to power within the United States. Charles Carroll of Carrollton wrote to his son, indicating that he was pleased that his portrait was directly across from George Washington's in Homewood's drawing room. By pairing the 2 men in one of the house's public spaces, the Carrolls are reminding their guests that not only are they aware of classical and patriotic fashions, but they have a particular claim to getting to set these fashions with close ties to these founding fathers. While a superficial examination of Homewood's architecture highlights the impression of power and family wealth and connections that the Carrolls sought to give, an only slightly closer look at this house will reveal the labor with which that power was supported. Like history in general, the whole story of something is often a mix of the seen and unseen. So let's take a moment to look at this brick from Homewood that was made by enslaved hands. When you look closely at it, you might be able to see here how one end at the bottom is darker than the other. So that brick would have been intentionally burned at the bottom to a certain shade, formed by hand in a uniform shape, and laid carefully with its piers to create a complex brick pattern in the house intended to show the wealth and craftsman's skill. The legacy of enslavement is literally built into the bones of this building. So at the time of Homewood's construction, Baltimore is experiencing a unique population boom. With a harbor deeper than Annapolis's and its proximity to both Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia, the city's economic potential caused this boom from 13,000 people in 1790 to 46,000 people in 1810, that 20 years difference, making it the 3rd most populated city in the United States. At the same time, Maryland's cash crop had changed from labor-intensive tobacco to wheat, which required less hands for caretaking and harvesting. Enslaved labor from eastern Maryland was consequently sent to Baltimore to be leased by their enslavers to work on construction and shipping in the city. You see this with Frederick Douglass and his story. At the same time, there's a free black population that's also beginning to grow and establish themselves, resulting in a very complexly populated Baltimore, whose makeup would have undoubtedly been seen among the people who labored at Homewood. And going back to Homewood's layout, I mentioned earlier that the 5-part plan allowed the hiding of spaces so that everything in the house could sort of run like magic. The impressive public entertaining spaces like the drawing room we saw earlier that were heavily decorated with symbols of American freedom were the main spaces a guest of the Carrolls would have experienced. The theater of the public rooms, however, required labor happening in the kitchen and butler's pantry in the west wing of the house, which could be hidden from the Carrolls and their guests with doors that would close off the hyphen from view in the main block. And we actually still use these doors today when we do programming and we're trying to control traffic, and it hides full parts of the building. At the time that the Carrolls lived at Homewood, several other young families were forced to live and labor on the estate. The butler, William Ross, who would have slept during late nights in the butler's pantry, was married to Rebecca and had 2 children, all of whom came with Harriet to Philadelphia when she left the marriage in 1816 and found in census records, they're found actually in census records, decades later living as a free black family. Then there's the house's gardener, Isadot Connor, who maintained the Palladian gardens of Homewood's farm. He lived at Homewood with his wife Sis and several children. After the Carrolls' marriage ended, the family was leased down south in Louisiana, likely to work on cotton plantations. Only a few of them return alive, and only Sis lived to see emancipation. Finally, there was Charity Castle, who was assaulted by Charles Carroll of Homewood and had asked Harriet to not return when she accompanied her on one of her visits to Philadelphia. Before her fate could be decided, Charity hit her head on a woodpile and was unable to travel, bringing her enslaved status into question after she had spent 6 months in Philadelphia. And they had laws in place at that time. After 6 months, you'd be automatically freed, so this becomes a bit of a problem. Her case went up to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, but her fate remains unknown. We just know that she never returns to Homewood. Others we know even less about. An 1830s clothing allotment ledger in the collection of the Howard County Historical Society mentions here a John Castle, one leg, at Homewood. So in one short line, we get a picture of a person who once existed inside of this house. Those enslaved at Homewood did not get to design the house in the same way that the Carrolls did. However, they still had a material impact. They built it, they maintained it, and they lived in it. And all of that is still important to people who are alive today, because I'm going to take a quick detour to highlight this ledger for a moment. For years, this ledger was actually unavailable for research due to active mold damage. Through a collaboration with Howard County Historical Society, our conservation lab at Hopkins cleaned it and digitized it so that it would be freely accessible to Howard County's researchers. Within days of its availability, researchers seeking to learn more about their enslaved ancestors requested this book, and some made really important research breakthroughs to their research. And I think that shows how this historic document has a very real and active life that is important in the present day, that this history is ultimately not that long ago. So from Homewood's earliest roots, we see a house that was very consciously designed to be a seat of power and fashion for American elite, while also forcibly enslaving people who resisted that power in a multitude of ways. The first generation of Homewood's families all had young children who crowded the halls of this building. This was a loud building at that time. And these young families were setting the tone for a new country. While Homewood Museum's main period of interpretation today concludes in 1816 upon the dramatic end of the Carrolls' marriage, Homewood remains. It was rented out off and on until the 1830s, when it was purchased by a mercantile family who gifted the estate and land to Johns Hopkins University. That's what brings us to the next period of Homewood's history to discuss, when Homewood became a museum for the first time as a product of the colonial revival. The years between when we left off in 1816 and where we are picking up in 1928 were busy ones for Baltimore, a city heavily impacted by the Civil War in the 1860s as well as the Industrial Revolution. People looking to work for factories moved to urban areas from rural homesteads and lived in small dwelling spaces next to a rapidly growing immigrant community. In the early 20th century, Baltimore was the United States' third largest port of entry, and over 1.2 million Europeans went through the city between the end of the Civil War and beginning of World War I. German, Irish, and Polish immigrants, among many others, chose to settle in Baltimore, living in neighborhoods not too far from old money families who could trace their lineage to 17th century Maryland colonists. The result of these close quarters and increasing insecurity among the American elite in regard to immigration, unionization, and other results of the Industrial Revolution was a new design movement, the Colonial Revival, which presented a nostalgic, romanticized concept of the 18th century United States. Buildings in the United States with connections, no matter how distant, to founding fathers started to take prominence. You know the George Washington's left here stories. And objects from the period garnered increasing interest among a group of people who yearned for what they considered a simpler time in American history. And the Colonial Revival era saw the birth of many of our famous historic museums today, including Colonial Williamsburg, Shelburne in Vermont, and Winterthur in Delaware. These museums were kickstarted by wealthy collectors. The Rockefellers, Electra Havemeyer-Webb, and Henry Francis DuPont directed their money and collecting interest towards American antiques, which is actually at the time quite a revolutionary departure from the generation before them that sought to establish American homes as grand European country estates filled with European antiques. We talked earlier about how we're looking at how Europe has this ancient story that we didn't have, so they're still self-conscious about that up to this point. It shouldn't be a surprise then that in this era, Homewood, with its Palladian architecture and connection to Charles Carroll, also received attention during the Colonial Revival. In the early years of the Homewood campus, Johns Hopkins University struggled to determine what to do with the historic house that the campus was growing around. At this point, they had been using it as the home of the Hopkins Club and dorms for some graduate school students. So when the Baltimore group, the Friends of Art, approached Hopkins seeking Homewood as a site for a new exhibition, the university accepted. And the Friends of Art were at first sight kind of an unexpected group to get involved with Homewood. They're comprised of elite Baltimoreans with an interest in art, and they tended to focus on exhibitions related to contemporary artists who were emerging in the field, including women like Maria Hamill-Finkelstein, whose work you can see here on the left, now at the Baltimore Museum of Art. And just a fun fact, the group was at times led by Alice Warder Garrett over here, whose home, Evergreen, is our other historic house museum. So it's a very classic Baltimore moment for us. The fact that an art group comprised of people who were inclined towards modern art chose to develop a decorative arts exhibition at Homewood in 1928 highlights the growing interest at the time in the American Historic House Museum, American artifacts, and American history. And photographs of that installation can actually tell us quite a lot about its intent. A lot of the antiques came from old Maryland families and houses. They weren't overly concerned about the time period fitting Homewood so much as the impressiveness of an object's provenance or appearance. The painted Baltimore bench on the right, for example, it's hard to see, was in private hands at the time, but it's now in the collection of the Maryland Center for History and Culture and was originally purchased to furnish one of the country estates of Charles Carrollton's daughters. Another object that you might recognize that hung at Homewood for this exhibition was Thomas Sully's portrait of Eliza Ridgely and her harp, now at the National Gallery of Art. Eliza was commissioned for Hampton in Baltimore County and once again was in private hands at the time of this display. So the fact that many of these objects on display for Friends of Art were part of private collections was a little bit of the exhibition's appeal for other enthusiasts of the Colonial Revival. These objects were still connected with the original families who commissioned them over 100 years ago. So it sends this message of power that these families still have the money and estates that they had at the beginning of the country's history. The emphasis on old families and provenance of the 1928 temporary exhibition at Homewood set the stage for its next incarnation in the 1930s and other members of the American elite who felt perhaps left out of that initial exhibition. Francis Patrick Garvin was a lawyer and he was the president of the Chemical Foundation, as well as another prominent collector of American decorative arts. So today, he's probably most well remembered for his antiques, which served as the foundation for Yale Art Gallery's American Decorative Arts collection. You can see an image of their furniture storage on this slide. A ton of this is Garvin, so a lot of it goes to Yale. Garvin was a New England man, and he attended Yale, not Hopkins. However, when Hopkins proposed converting the Homewood building into a school for lawyers, Garvin protested, considering the house a shrine that should not be significantly altered. And that's a word you hear a lot in the colonial revival. They're calling these places shrines. His reasons for that go back to the Catholic roots of the Carroll family. Garvin was also a Catholic, and due to anti-Catholic sentiment at the time, was prohibited from joining certain men's clubs despite his wealth. For Garvin, Homewood's connection to the Carrolls and their association with Catholic religious freedom was a meaningful part of the colonial revival story that made him want to save it. With a gift to Hopkins and the university's blessings, Garvin brought in R.T. Halsey, the originator of the Metropolitan Museum of Art's famed period rooms in the American wing. Halsey used Garvin's collection to create the first concept of Homewood as a historic house museum, fully. So compared to images of the Friends of Art exhibition, the personal provenance of the objects has become less important as opposed to their connection to the field of American decorative art as a place of study. However, like the Friends of Art exhibition, Halsey and Garvin were not overly concerned with adhering to any sort of specific time or regional constraints. Items like this Duncan Fife card table made in New York would never have been purchased for Homewood, a Baltimore house that was furnished 10 years before this table's earliest possible creation. Garvin's period of interpretation at Homewood ends up lasting several years, actually, because of the Depression, until he had the objects relocated to Yale as part of his major collection gift to his alma mater. Still, some of the objects he chose to keep behind at Homewood, such as this Staffordshire hard-paste porcelain figurine of William Shakespeare. So these items become the beginning, the root of Homewood's future collection, even though they're not thinking that Homewood's going to be a museum at this time. Looking at both exhibitions, it's clear that people are missing from this story. Like the bones of Homewood being constructed to obscure certain parts of American history, these exhibitions created a colonial America that was never real. Happy enslavement, wealth, and beauty were means of holding on to power that an elite group of people in the midst of world wars, immigration, and industrialization were feeling unstabilized during. When Garvin's exhibition comes down, the building was fully taken over for use of administrative offices for the university. While the furniture changed, other minor changes in the house started to reveal changing trends in American history. In the late 1930s, a woman's bathroom was added to Homewood's basement, signaling a greater acceptance of women in the workplace at Hopkins. Still, at this time, women were only permitted to study at Hopkins as graduate students. During the 40 years that Homewood served as administrative offices, the house would witness firsthand some of those drastic changes in American social movements, but this is sort of the first inkling. So the final period I'm going to focus on today is that administrative era, when Homewood served as the central administrative offices for the university. As the site of the president's office, advisors' offices, and the university registrar, the house served as a site of educational authority during a fundamental period of social change for the nation, as well as for the university, particularly during the 1960s and 1970s. Of course, these 2 decades are characterized by movements for racial and gender equality, the space race, the Vietnam War, assassinations of major historical figures, and a new wave of environmentalism. So when we think of American history in respect to the 250th, we tend to go to the very beginning. But these 2 decades of cultural, political, and social upheaval are fundamentally transforming the country. And Hopkins is a fitting example of how these large national movements played out on a smaller scale. In the same period of time, the undergraduate body of the university moved away from its emphasis on white men from wealthy American families to welcome students, both men and women, from different backgrounds. This doesn't necessarily go smoothly. There's a famous incident in which the campus barber refuses to work with black students, and that becomes a big thing in Hopkins history. This period of time for the university, like it is for the nation, is fundamentally defined by the advocacy of students. When the school's anti-segregationist and labor activist chaplain, Chester Wickwire, was at risk of being removed from staff in the mid-1960s, over 90% of the student body signed a petition in support of him over the course of just 2 days. So this is a student group that can mobilize very quickly. Once again, Homewood's architecture as a source of power becomes important, showing how Palladian architecture really endures in the American psyche as a monumental form of architectural language. Just look for a moment how these routine pieces of office furniture squeeze in among like gilt candlesticks that you can see on the edge, and this like really enormous door frame. So if you imagine for a moment being 18 years old in this space, and this is the first time you're going to university, you might be the first person in your family going to university, imagine how this might make you feel. In fact, Homewood's architectural significance was so important that in early designs for the university's Homewood campus, there was going to be a second Homewood that was designed to sit opposite of it, with the library between them. So here's Homewood, the real one. Here's their second Homewood, and then they have a library right between them. And they do still have that library. They did not build the second Homewood. But they did design that early campus building after Homewood's image, even commissioning a special building brick known as the Homewood brick by the Baltimore Brick Company to be used in construction to ensure that everything matched. And those bricks, by the way, then were used in other universities like Duke, so you can see building legacies continue in some unusual ways. And they're very easy to spot if you're walking around because they have Homewood stamped on them. So if you're ever looking down and seeing that, you know it comes from this house. During the administrative era, the university's president's office was in the former best bedchamber of Homewood, one of the largest rooms set fairly far back from the main entrance. Notably, the best bedchamber ceiling is the only room with the same height as the front portico with its temple front surround. It also has a central ceiling medallion that matches the front portico, creating a tie between that temple exterior and an interior space. Placing the university's president's office in this space that you would need to access by walking down a narrow hallway past the secretary's office re-highlights the psychological impact of points of access in the house and architectural impressions. You know you're in a place of power when you're here. Between 1967 and 1971, the university's president was Lincoln Gordon. During his tenure, Hopkins was suffering a financial crisis, resulting in Gordon ordering budget cuts and becoming pretty unpopular with faculty. Despite overseeing the introduction of coeducation to campus and expressing opposition to the Vietnam War, he was unpopular with students for his revisions to the Student Conduct Code and for maintaining the ROTC presence on campus. In the 4 years of Gordon's presidency, at least 2 significant sit-ins took place outside of Homewood, one run by students against the Vietnam War, and another organized by faculty that were mad about the budget cuts and the reduction of professorships during a period of increase of administrative staff. So classic problems in university histories. These 2 events turned Homewood into a site of literal protest and a reclamation of the site from university structural power. This is when the house earns its name, Fort Gordon. There are other smaller but no less important moments of protest that took place at Homewood that have a certain level of poetic justice to the house's history. In 1967, 2 black undergraduate students, John Guess, who's pictured here, and Bruce Baker founded the Black Student Organization on campus, now the Black Student Union. When the university ignored the BSO's request to be recognized as an official student group, Guess and Baker staged a sit-in inside of Homewood, where they presented a document known as the 10 Demands. That's this document over here. You don't have to read it, you don't have to try to read it, just so you see it exists. The document asked the administration for more inclusion of black literature and history, more undergraduate black students and professors, and an establishment of a committee to improve race relations on campus. Ultimately, Guess and Baker's sit-in did earn recognition from the administration, marking the recognized start of the Black Student Organization. So think for a moment of Homewood's earliest years as a site of forced labor for so many black families. When we talk about American history, if we restrict it to those early years, we are discussing and acknowledging an important part of our history, but one far enough away that we can distance ourselves from it. Here, this is close enough that these men are still alive. They remind us that humans drive historic events, and they took agency and power in a way former black residents of Homewood systemically could not. These student-organized movements left behind ephemera in our archive and private collections today that I think continue to highlight the sense of a close connection to the past. The apartheid poster in the center of this slide includes signatures from student groups we might expect, like the BSU, Feminist Alliance, and International Studies Forum, but it also includes the Karate Club. And really, isn't that just like college in a nutshell, with students with this wide range of interests and backgrounds joining together for something? There's one student, Mindy Farber, whose pin collection she had as a student incorporates political, social, and university pride pins all together in one pile. It materially shows us that history does not exist in a vacuum, but is constantly sort of overlapping itself. And speaking of Mindy Farber, that particular student, the last thing I want to talk about as a pivotal part of Homewood's administration era is the first class of undergraduate women. While women were incorporated early into graduate study at Hopkins, like we talked about, the university was relatively late in accepting them onto the undergraduate campus. Motivated by its academic IB competitors who had just become coeducational The first class of women started in fall 1970. When these women started, they faced blatant sexism from professors and certain male students who felt that they were a distraction from their studies. The architecture wasn't fully designed with them in mind. So for instance, bathrooms would have mirrors placed too high, so they would have to jump to see themselves. They would need to take a bus to the hospital to see a doctor, as there were no doctors for women practicing on campus. So in some cases also, the lack of changes made to a property are just as much a sign of American psyche at a historic moment in time as changes being made. Eventually, administration moves offices to Gilman Hall in the 1970s, but that doesn't necessarily mean that memories of Homewood's days as a site of protest and power are gone. This past April, for instance, there was a program on the steps of the museums where a Peabody graduate sang songs from that era, and the way her voice echoed across campus became, because of where Homewood is situated in the center of the university's main landscape, you can see the impact that its position still has on the daily operation of campuses today. And talking about the present, that brings us to Homewood's most recent incarnation as a house museum that seeks to be a place to draw connections between historic events and the contemporary concerns of students today. Though the museum opened in 1987, its latest form began as early as the year that the administrative offices moved to the newer Garland Hall on campus in the 1970s. Robert Merrick, this dashing man down here, who stayed at Homewood when it was temporarily used as graduate dorms in the 1920s, offered to fund the restoration of the house right around the time of the bicentennial, when American nostalgia and patriotism is particularly high, and people working on this restoration have these really beautiful memories of sitting on the steps of Homewood, seeing the bicentennial fireworks go off and things like that. So there's this sort of fervor happening. As a result, the university formed a restoration committee composed of architectural experts, curators, and others to conduct a comprehensive restoration and furnishing of the house as it would have looked during the era that the Carrolls lived there, from 1800 to 1816. 40 years later, that restoration committee's research continues to hold up, which is pretty impressive when you think about how we have totally different access to resources today. New documents are always appearing. The internet is now much more searchable than it was even 5 years ago, and it's continuing to really hold. Still, that being said, the Carrolls did not leave behind a complete inventory of Homewood upon Charles Carroll of Homewood's death, because Harriet had been granted permission by her father-in-law to take furniture with her when she left her husband and moved back with her family to Philadelphia. There was no sort of smoking gun of an archival resource that probate inventory might normally provide. Homewood's restoration furnishings relied on the inventories of neighboring estates to create an impression of a Baltimore house. Well-researched and accurate, a time-traveling Carroll might recognize the house, but it's still a creation and conception of what things might have been. And over the years, the house at first glance has largely remained the same. Science has adjusted some earlier research. For instance, improvements in microscopic paint analysis allowed us to revise the paint colors on the wall. New funding also allowed things that had been hoped for but not afforded in the original restoration, such as wallpaper in the drawing room. But as the world around us changes, so does the house. As new generations of students and museum goers begin to ask different questions about social history, Homewood slowly pivots from a historic house museum intended for an audience of people interested in the scholarship and accuracy of a restoration towards prioritizing stories of enslavement in the house, and today is continuing to evolve to experiment with transparent understandings of what it means to tell the full history of the house. We like to say that we moved from a decorative arts museum to a material culture museum. So the objects are still the priority at Homewood, but we're looking at them as historical documents. One of the key ways that we bring the needs of modern United States into Homewood is by creating many opportunities for thoughtful student experiences. From classes at Homewood to exhibitions that foster creativity, such as the one on the top left here, in which students selected objects from Homewood's collection, conducted semester-long research, and composed a poem for a writing seminar course. We've welcomed our students that we can foster a current generation that sees the importance of learning from their past and thinking critically about how it influences their present day. One of the internships that took place for this exhibition was working with Hopkins undergraduate student Hadid Habib, who's right here, who conducted original research in the 1970s at Homewood. His internship was funded by Hopkins alum John Guess, who you might remember as the co-founder of Hopkins Black Student Union, and you see him there with Hadid They were hilarious together. Homewood continues to serve as a representative of greater university themes, and its location on the campus beach means that it is frequently quietly in the background of graduation photos, student events, and student-organized movements. Even in recent years, Homewood has witnessed recent protests that in turn are often representative of greater themes and concerns on the national stage. While the students today may not realize it, university archivists have been at work collecting photographs and ephemera, like this poster here from a 2019 sit-in, setting up their place in the greater story of the university's history. And that is what I think is most important during our 250th anniversary as a nation. We might feel like bystanders when we take a tour of a historic house museum, but we are playing an active role in shaping its present and its future. And perhaps one day, people might be studying us. I don't know. The history of Homewood Museum is not one of a few great men in one period of time, but a crowd of individuals who leave tangible impacts over the span of generations upon the house. And this right here is a great example of that. I mentioned paint analysis earlier. This is a microscopic paint analysis of Homewood, and you can see all these little colors here are different layers of paint over time. The history of the everyday is American history, and one of the best ways to find it is through the objects and architecture that people leave behind, because we change places to suit our wants and needs. At Homewood, there was a generation of school children in the early 20th century, and they might have respected the architecture of the main house. That's what all accounts say, I believe them. But they also left behind plenty of graffiti in the house's privy outbuilding. And today, that graffiti is historically quite interesting and protected. While we may not be graffitiing the bathroom as a house museum, we continue to make changes to the house. Upstairs, away from the public period rooms, our collection storage has been designed to fit in with the unusual shape of what was probably a former bedroom. Our wine cellar is now a classroom, and our Madeira garret is where we house the printer. Throughout its 224-year history, Homewood has witnessed the start of a nation and the early days of a university. Hopefully, we can prepare Homewood as a space for 224 more years of students and visitors, and that's what we're thinking about a lot this year. I want to thank you all for coming to today's lecture. I encourage you to visit Homewood Museum. We're open Tuesday through Sunday, 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. for self-guided tours. And this exhibition in particular is going to be up through the rest of 2026. So at this point, I am happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you. Any questions? Yeah.
Do you know where slaves lived during the time of the Carols?
Oh, great question. Yeah, so we have some ideas. We don't have a definite answer for you, but we're pretty sure that there were some places they may have been living in the basement of Homewood and on the top floor. Architecturally speaking, there's some theories about that. The top floor had bedrooms, we're pretty sure, for the children. There's two rooms that have fireplaces, and there's two rooms that do not. We believe that the enslaved families may have been in the rooms that did not have fireplaces. We also know that people like William Ross, he stayed in the butler's pantry, which was inside of Homewood. And his wife may have been sleeping in a pallet on the floor outside of the best bedchamber, because Harriet was having a lot of children at the time, and so she would have a nursemaid there too. We think there's probably other buildings. We do know about a building that's later that appears to have been an overseer's house, probably like 1820s, I want to say, and that building was taken down in 2003, so it's pretty well documented. But we don't have the definitive remains yet. There's a lot of theories about the landscape of Homewood, but because that city has grown around it, it's really hard to do that landscaping. However, there's a lot of architecture going up around Homewood right now, so I'm hoping we might get a chance to do some LiDAR or something and get that sense of what the outbuilding situation was there.
Do you know how many slaves they had when they lived there?
I think at its max is upwards of 30. And part of that is because Homewood as an estate was never really meant to sustain itself. So a plantation is going to be growing crops that it can sell, that it can feed itself. And that is the case with the Carroll's property to Reagan in Howard County. Homewood is sort of meant to be a practice site for Charles Carroll of Homewood, who would, in theory, eventually inherit Joe Reagan. In reality, he does not. And so there are gardens at Homewood. There's things that are growing, but they're being sustained by Joe Reagan, and that's part of why that number might be a little bit lower than you would expect. A lot of those people are going to be gardeners. They're going to be in the house. There's people like Sis Connor, who was from Joe Reagan. She was a spinner. Homewood doesn't have, we're not doing spinning at Homewood, and so her role changes at Homewood to be in the house.
What was the original acreage?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm very bad at numbers, but I can give you, in your mind's eye, the landscape. If you have been to this part of Baltimore, the Baltimore Museum of Art is part of the original Homewood estate. And so if you think about the Hopkins landscape and the Hopkins Homewood campus and extend it all the way down to the Wyman Park Dell, which is a park right there, and then I believe it captures some of the neighborhood around it too, but especially up front there, that is the original layout of Homewood. If you go to the BMA and you go through the BMA sculpture garden, you'll notice it's a lot lower than the land around it, and that is actually the original sort of, they built up that land over time. So that gives you an idea of the sloping hill you would have seen. Originally at Homewood, the approach would have been like an English country estate. So you would be seeing glimpses of the house. You would be taking the serpentine route up to the house, and it would be like glimpses through the trees. And from Homewood, you could look down to the harbor. So that's how much has been built up over time. And it looks quite different today because of that. We do still have two outbuildings, the Carriage House, which is now our theater building. So you can go see plays there. And the Privy, which is preserved, as you saw in the picture there.
Are there other similar buildings in the area that you would recommend we visit?
Yeah, well, I'm going to start by recommending Evergreen, which is a mile down the road of Homewood, and it is a Gilded Age mansion. It's the other Hopkins Museum, and it is a totally different beast. And I always think it's really nice to see Homewood and Evergreen in one day and get just two very different approaches to house museums. Hopkins had both of them by the 90s, but they have largely grown up separately. These two museums merged in 2021. So we have one director, one curator, one programming manager for all of them, and then they each have their separate staff. So it's just very interesting to see that house too and get another perspective. Other places that I would recommend in Baltimore, I think if you are feeling a historic house day, there's always Cliveden, which is Johns Hopkins' actual house, Johns Hopkins the man. It's not a far drive from Homewood. I would say maybe like 5 or 6 minutes in the car. And they do not have it furnished. It's architecturally preserved, and there are crazy murals inside that house. The architectural preservation is fascinating. And it's now in a public park, so you also get kind of this interesting sense of the landscape there too. So I think I booked up your full Historic House Museum Day in Baltimore, but if you want to get lunch, go to Gertrude's at the BMA, so you get a little bit of a museum too. Yeah.
I'd like to give a plug for an event that will be here in Frederick, October 24th. I'm involved with a committee, and we're having a Charles Carroll Day.
Oh, that's great.
At the Manor House, which is, hi John, on the, where East Alco Aluminum Company was, and now that's where the data centers are going in. But the house was believed to be built by the grandson, who never really lived there.
Yeah.
Nobody really, I always thought it was the original Charles Carroll's house. Found out years later, no, he didn't leave Annapolis.
Very confusing.
Yes, very confusing. But we are going to be giving a tour, we'll give a driving tour to an individual instead of having a bus to take everyone around to see the enormity of this 12,000 acre Carrollton Manor, because most people don't have a concept of that.
Yeah.
So October 24th at St. Joseph's Church on Carrollton Manor on Manor Woods Road.
That's
so
wonderful.
Just to let anyone who's interested, and then you get to just that one day just do a drive around.
And you know what, I'll piggyback off of that being pretty important, because one of the unique things about the Carroll family in Maryland is a lot of their houses are sometimes or always open to the public. So Doe Reagan is still in family hands. You can't get into Doe Reagan, but there's other houses, including Mount Clair in Baltimore City. There's Carrollton Hall in Howard County, which is on the Franciscan Shrine. And then there's the Charles Carroll House of Annapolis as well.
Yes.
And it's fascinating going to all these different houses and getting a sense of the different ways, and I should say there's also the Carroll Mansion in Baltimore, but the different ways that these are all approached, but also similarities in how they were built, because they're all in very different landscapes in Maryland, but it's the same family building them, and they have the same sort of knowledge that they're pulling from, the same sort of architectural backgrounds, and I think it's fascinating when you start looking at all these different houses. And in the past couple of years, we've been working a lot with Carrollton Hall and Mount Clair in particular, where we're all trying to build a sort of better conversation between the Carroll houses, so that we're all aware of what each other's doing and can promote each other. So I really appreciate you bringing that up.
October 24th.
October 24th. Perfect. Yes.
On October the 8th, a Thursday at 6 p.m. at Heritage Frederick here on East Church Street, there will be a lecture on Charles Carroll.
Oh, great. You said, I'm sorry, Charles or?
Charles Carroll of Carrollton.
Of Carrollton, yep.
Father.
Great.
Yes.
And I believe Carroll County might also have an exhibition that they just opened that includes some Charles Carroll objects too.
Oh, interesting.
So yeah, this is a good year if you're interested in learning more about the Carrolls. They're very interesting. Charles Carroll, Carrollton in particular, is a very fun guy to learn about. But
Fun guy?
yeah, he's pretty sassy. He has some good one-liners, but the family themselves are fascinating, and the way they approach a lot of their life and their identity are really interesting. And they still name their children Charles today. We work with many of the current descendants. They're lovely. And it's just, they're a very interesting family. Well, thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Please reach out if you have any further questions.
You were going to tell us about Evergreen.
I would love to tell you about Evergreen. Yeah. So Evergreen was built, well, this one was built in 1801. Evergreen's first built in 1868, I believe. And it's meant to be sort of this suburban McMansion. So not architecturally significant. It's for the Broadbent family. And it's a mile up the road, but at that point, it's full suburbs, whereas Homewood's already growing into the city. The Garrett family of the B&O Railroad purchases Evergreen in the 1870s, late 1870s, and T. Harrison Garrett, who is the son of our B&O Railroad Garrett, we have a lot of sons of famous guys moving into these houses. He moves in with his 3 young boys and his wife, and they start tacking on structures to Evergreen. And then the son, John Warp Garrett, inherits in 1920, and he marries this woman, Alice Warder Garrett, who's like a firecracker. She comes from DC, and she travels with John through his diplomatic career around Europe. They meet while she's doing singing lessons in Europe, and through his diplomatic postings, she's making artistic connections, and she has this really firm belief in the 1910s, the 1920s, 1930s when she's collecting, that if you are rich enough to collect art, you don't just collect the famous guys, you collect art that speaks to you, art that you have a relationship with the artist. It's actually a great, this is Alice Warder Garrett vibes here where we are, but to have that sort of, you collect what you really like and that you foster artists too. So she builds a really interesting collection. We have, the big names. We've got Picasso, Modigliani, Degas, but then we also have Raoul Dufy, a Fauvist painter who just painted sort of joy and life. And we have a theater by Russian designer Leon Bakst, who was the designer for the Ballet Russe. And just lots of oddball things from what she was interested in. And she also believed in, I mentioned fostering art in Baltimore in particular. So she created what she called Genius Wing, where she had emerging artists, like musical arts quartet and stuff, would stay at Evergreen and create art. And so that space is a totally different animal. It's available for tours. We don't do self-guided at Evergreen because the house is massive, because they were tacking on rooms to it all the time. But I would highly recommend it. It's a our slogan for Evergreen internally is, but wait, there's more, because you never know what you're going to find from one room to the next.
Is this the same family that built Uplands, the Normandy Chateau?
Yes, I believe it is. I'm not, sorry, what did you just say about Uplands?
Was this also built by Garrett family?
Yes. And so the Garretts, like the Carrolls, are interesting because they also have a couple of different properties.
Right.
Montebello is another one, which has a really interesting, if you like horses, it's an interesting horse story. It's one of the original thoroughbred breeding areas. But they also do. And Uplands was, I can't remember the connection. It's not T. Harrison's line directly, but I think it might be Mary Garrett estate, I think. Yeah. So yeah, they are connected. I think there's some interesting pieces that are still in the family from Uplands as well. Yeah. Great. Well, you know where to reach me. And if you don't, I'll make sure that we have email information. And please come visit us.
Thank you.